The morning sun spilled gold across St. Mary Mead, turning the dew on the hedgerows into a shimmer of tiny stars, and Miss Marple, as was her custom, set out for her early walk, basket in hand and eyes alert to the smallest irregularity in the familiar village lanes. Her neighbors were already stirring, Mrs. Bantry fussing over the flower beds in front of her cottage, Mr. Tucker checking his small but neat vegetable patch, and the postmistress, Miss Greenway, adjusting the ribbons on parcels as she prepared for the morning mail. There was a lightness in the air, an almost imperceptible hum of routine, the kind of ordinary day that promised nothing more exciting than the exchange of pleasantries and the occasional gossip. Yet Miss Marple, attuned to the rhythms of human behavior, noticed the subtle deviations. The way Simmons, the Colonel's butler, lingered too long near the Grange gate, or the glance of unease Miss Delorier cast at the church clock as she passed. Such things, she thought, were often more revealing than words, for people may lie loud, but their bodies rarely do. By the time she reached the village green, the tranquility of the morning was punctuated by the arrival of Mr. Pettigrew, the solicitor, who hurried along with papers clutched tightly under one arm, a frown deepening the lines of his usually composed face. He paused when he saw Miss Marple, offering a brisk nod before continuing toward the Grange. The look of urgency in his step spoke volumes to her, and though she pretended to busy herself with adjusting a stray ribbon in her basket, she made a mental note to inquire. Later villagers were beginning to gather on the green, exchanging whispers in low tones that carried just enough to suggest scandal without making it explicit. Mrs. Price Ridley was at the forefront, waving a hand to emphasize her points as she informed Miss Hartnell and a small audience of their fellow villagers that Colonel Melchett's sudden illness and subsequent death had been preceded by mysterious visits from his solicitor. The words were hushed but precise, carefully designed to reach the ears of any who might be listening, and Miss Marple observed the interplay of faces, some drawn tight with concern, others lit with curiosity that bordered on relish. The human tendency to assume guilt, she reflected, was as predictable as the tides. Miss Marple lingered near the edge of the green, quietly noting the arrivals of Dr. Haydock and the young gardener, Timothy, who appeared uneasy, as if reluctant to face those gathered. The doctor's expression was grave, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling briefly on her, and Miss Marple nodded in silent acknowledgement. She knew Dr. Haydock well enough to detect that his concern was more than professional decorum. There was a personal stake in the Colonel's well-being, and the weight of responsibility sat heavily upon him. Timothy, by contrast, fidgeted with the straps of his cap and avoided eye contact, betraying a mix of fear and anticipation. Miss Marple made a mental note of these details, for even the smallest gestures often held significance when disentangling the tangle of human motives. The Colonel's death, she suspected, would reveal layers of human complexity far beyond what casual observation could uncover. As the morning progressed, the solicitor's arrival at Melchett Grange stirred the village further. Carriages rumbled along the lane, and the low hum of conversation gave way to a near silence, punctuated by occasional exclamations. Miss Marple followed discreetly, ensuring her presence remained unobtrusive, and observed the scene from the privacy of a hedgerow. Simmons emerged to meet Mr. Pettigrew, the butler's hands trembling ever so slightly as he handed over a key and a set of papers. Miss Delorier appeared at the window, her face pale, hands clasped nervously, and for a moment their eyes met. There was a fleeting recognition of mutual understanding, or was it apprehension? Miss Marple allowed herself a small, imperceptible smile. The truth, she thought, often lingered in the briefest exchanges, in moments that seemed too insignificant for anyone else to notice. By mid-morning, the village was alive with speculation. Shopkeepers whispered across counters, children were warned to speak softly, and the occasional visitor paused to ask whether Colonel Melchett's sudden demise was natural or the result of darker circumstances. Miss Marple, returning to her cottage, carried her basket more heavily than usual, though it was empty save for her knitting. Her mind worked quietly, piecing together the sequence of events, the tension in faces, the inconsistencies in stories, and the subtle, nervous movements she had observed. Each detail, she knew, was a thread, and a single thread could unravel the entire tapestry, or reveal the carefully hidden pattern beneath. As she crossed the village green once more, the wind stirring the leaves with gentle insistence, she reflected on the peculiar way ordinary days could shift so suddenly into events of consequence. A garden party might seem merely festive, a routine walk to the post office entirely mundane, yet under the surface, intentions collided, fears intersected, and the smallest action could precipitate outcomes no one had foreseen. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the lane, glancing up toward Melchett Grange. The house, normally dignified and serene, now appeared as though it held its breath. Shadows stretched long across the lawn, and the oak door remained closed, yet the subtle signs, the carriage wheels still warm in the gravel, the curtains drawn uneasily, suggested that within those walls the air was thick with more than grief. She tucked her knitting into her basket and set off along the lane, moving as always with deliberate slowness, her mind alert to every nuance, every shift of posture, every fleeting expression. The morning, she realized, was only the beginning. Beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, secrets waited, intertwined with pride, fear, and perhaps the faintest glimmer of guilt, and Miss Marple, as ever, was ready to observe, to listen, and to unravel the truth. By mid-morning, St. Mary Mead had taken on the uneasy stillness that often precedes discovery, as if the village itself held its breath, waiting to see how events would unfold. Miss Marple, as ever, moved quietly among the cottages and lanes, nodding politely to neighbors, but observing keenly the subtle signals of human behavior that so often revealed more than words ever could. She noted Mrs. Bantry's fidgeting hands as she arranged flowers by the gate, the restless glance Mr. Tucker cast toward the Grange, and the almost imperceptible tremor in Timothy's shoulders as he carried parcels from the post office. Each movement, each hesitation, each whispered aside, was a clue in its own right, forming a delicate lattice of human intention that Miss Marple could read with the same ease others reserved for a newspaper or a pattern in their knitting. Even the dogs seemed unsettled, pawing at the ground or pacing the fence line with a nervous energy that mirrored their owner's anxiety. News of Colonel Melchett's death had spread quickly, and by 10 o'clock a small gathering had formed near the edge of the village green. The crowd was a mixture of curiosity, concern, and barely disguised anticipation. Each person eager to learn more, yet careful to appear above suspicion. Mrs. Price Ridley stood with her parasol pressed tightly in her gloved hands, speaking in rapid, low tones to anyone who would listen about the unusual circumstances surrounding the Colonel's final days. She emphasized his recent change in will, the unexpected summons of Mr. Pettigrew, and the sudden presence of Miss Deloria, portraying each detail with the flourish of one recounting a scandalous tale, yet careful to avoid direct accusation. Miss Marple listened with the quiet patience that had become her hallmark, noting how Mrs. Price Ridley's face would twitch with excitement at moments that seemed trivial to others, yet indicated the satisfaction she derived from being the first to relay what she considered significant news. Meanwhile, Dr. Haydock arrived at the Grange once more, this time on foot, his medical bag slung across his shoulder, his expression grave and intent. Miss Marple watched as he paused at the gate, consulting with Simmons, the butler, whose fingers fidgeted nervously with the papers he carried. It was a fleeting moment, barely noticeable to anyone else, but Miss Marple noted the brief exchange of glances, the hesitation before a nod, and the slight tightening of Simmons' jaw. Such nuances, she reflected, were rarely accidental. They suggested knowledge or concern, possibly both, and were worth remembering for the careful unraveling of events to come. Timothy lingered in the background, adjusting the brim of his cap and shifting his weight from foot to foot. Clearly aware that all eyes were drawn toward the Grange and its secrets, Miss Marple made a mental note of his behavior, filing it alongside every glance, gesture, and murmur she had already observed, her mind weaving a tapestry of patterns that were invisible to the casual observer. By late morning, the solicitor arrived in his motor car, the engine rumbling softly against the stillness of the village. Miss Marple observed from behind a hedge as he stepped from the vehicle, briefcase in hand, and proceeded toward the Grange with Simmons and Dr. Haydock in tow. The scene was mundane to the untrained eye, a routine visit, perhaps, or simple attention to formalities. Yet the deliberate pace, the serious expressions, and the discreet glances all indicated that something more delicate was at play. Miss Marple noted the way Miss Deloria appeared at the upper window, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly, as though bracing herself for news she feared. There was a faint tension in the air, a sense that the carefully maintained order of the house had been disrupted by forces both human and unforeseen. The village, too, seemed to sense it, for conversations had dwindled to whispers, and those passing the Grange moved, as if not to disturb the invisible but tangible atmosphere of anticipation. Miss Marple returned to her cottage for a brief respite, carrying her basket heavier than usual. Though it contained nothing but her knitting, she sat by the window, observing the world outside as though viewing a play unfolding on a stage designed to reveal human character. Every passer-by, every gesture, every moment of hesitation was a line of dialogue in the unspoken story of the Colonel's final days. She reflected on the implications of a will changed so recently, on the motivations that might compel a man to alter his final wishes, and on the subtle interactions she had already witnessed. The human mind, she mused, was remarkably consistent in revealing itself, if only one had the patience and attention to notice. Even fear left traces, slight tremors, shifting postures, and fleeting glances that could, when combined, speak more clearly than any declaration. As noon approached, Miss Marple rose and strolled once more toward the Grange, her steps unhurried, her gaze alert to every subtlety. The shadows of the trees cast irregular patterns across the path, a reflection, she thought, of the irregularities in human behavior she sought to understand. Villagers now paused to glance at her, some curious, some anxious, but she offered only the gentlest nod, revealing nothing of her thoughts. Inside, she anticipated discovering more, the quiet signals, the nervous gestures, the small deceptions that formed the true narrative of the Colonel's final days. Each would bring her closer to understanding not only the events themselves, but the intricate web of intentions, fears, and pride that had led to them. For in St. Mary Mead, as in all human communities, the smallest action often had consequences far beyond what anyone could foresee. The day, she realized, was far from over, and the mystery of Colonel Melchett's sudden death had only begun to unfold. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had taken on the curious tension that arises when ordinary routine is interrupted by events far beyond expectation. Miss Marple, who had spent the morning quietly observing the movements and expressions of the villagers, now returned to the Grange under the pretense of visiting Mrs. Price Ridley to inquire after her health. The truth was that she wished to see the interior of the house herself, however casually, to note the subtleties in the arrangements, the placement of furniture, and the interactions between those remaining. The air outside was warm, but carried a faint chill in the shadows, a suggestion of the undercurrent of unease that seemed to flow invisibly through the village. She moved along the lane at her usual deliberate pace, her senses alert to every footstep, every whispered conversation, every glance that lingered too long or darted away too quickly. As she approached the Grange, Miss Marple noticed Simmons standing stiffly at the door, holding a set of papers with the precision of a man determined to maintain control despite inward anxiety. His eyes flickered toward the small cluster of villagers gathered near the gate, then back to the house, betraying a tension he clearly wished to conceal. Miss Deloria appeared momentarily at the upper window, her face pale, her hands pressed lightly against the sill, and she glanced down with a fleeting look that might have been fear or mere curiosity. Miss Marple made a mental note of the subtle tremor in the young woman's hand and the slight set of her shoulders, observations that would later prove significant in understanding motives and emotional states. These small gestures, invisible to anyone less patient or less attentive, provided insight into the undercurrents shaping events in ways no official report could capture. Inside the Grange, Dr. Haydock was conferring quietly with Mr. Pettigrew, his voice low but insistent, discussing the formalities surrounding the Colonel's passing and the legal processes now in motion. Miss Marple lingered in the hall, appearing merely to adjust a decorative mat, though her eyes missed nothing: the careful positioning of furniture, the half-open drawer in the study desk, the slight displacement of the Colonel's personal effects. All of these minutiae, she recognized, could betray concern, haste, or deliberate manipulation. Observing the interplay of the solicitor, the doctor, and Simmons, she noted the subtle exchanges of glances and gestures, tiny signals of uncertainty, of awareness of knowledge not openly shared. Human behavior, she reflected, often spoke louder than words. People lie, but their gestures rarely do. When the group turned their attention to Miss Deloria, who had descended from her perch near the window to stand nervously in the corridor, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. The young woman's tension was palpable, though she attempted to mask it with poise and civility. Her voice, calm and measured, betrayed only the smallest quiver at the edges, a hint that the recent upheavals had unsettled her more than she would admit. The solicitor handed her a sealed envelope containing the will, and her hands trembled as she accepted it, fingers brushing against the paper with a mix of hesitation and anticipation. Miss Marple's observations extended to these minutiae. The precise moment when Miss Deloria's eyes flickered to Simmons, and the almost imperceptible tilt of her head toward the study, suggested she understood more than she cared to reveal. Outside, the villagers had gathered in clusters, some whispering speculations while others attempted to mask their curiosity with affected disinterest. Miss Marple moved unobtrusively among them, catching snippets of conversations, noting the subtle cues of nervous energy, the way glances lingered on the Grange, the tension in voices that might otherwise have been cheerful. Mrs. Bantry, of course, was most vocal, recounting every minor observation with relish, while Mr. Tucker interjected sporadically, providing conjecture punctuated by exclamations and dramatic gestures. Each person, Miss Marple reflected, revealed in their own way the anxieties, suspicions, and perhaps secret knowledge that composed the social fabric of the village. By late afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, carrying a quiet satisfaction at the volume of information collected through mere observation. She laid out her notes, recalling the sequence of movements, glances, and gestures, and began to weave them into a coherent pattern, connecting cause and effect in the events surrounding the Colonel's death. She considered Simmons' anxious demeanor, the young companion's subtle fear, the solicitor's discreet urgency, and the villagers' varying degrees of curiosity and speculation. All of these strands, once teased apart and examined, would reveal motives, intentions, and possibly the precise chain of actions that had led to the Colonel's sudden demise. As the sun began to dip behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the village lanes, Miss Marple settled by the window with her knitting. The quiet click of her needles punctuated the soft hum of the evening, a counterpoint to the invisible tension that had been accumulating throughout the day. She understood that the narrative of human behavior, though often concealed by polite conversation and social propriety, could be read in detail if one had the patience to observe, to notice the slight hesitation, the nervous glance, the unspoken acknowledgement. The puzzle, she realized, was beginning to reveal itself, though much remained obscured. With a measured patience, She allowed herself to enjoy the thrill of anticipation, knowing that each day brought new information, each subtle gesture could confirm a suspicion or illuminate a hidden truth. In the calm of her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate interplay of human motives, the quiet collisions of fear, pride, and curiosity, and the certainty that, beneath the ordinary surface of St. Mary Mead, the extraordinary was quietly unfolding. The following morning arrived with a crispness that carried the promise of revelation, though Miss Marple, walking along the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead, noted immediately that the village itself seemed unsettled, as if it had sensed the weight of secrets hidden just beneath the surface. The birds sang with a distracted trill, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from chimneys, yet there was a tension that could not be attributed to weather. Alone, Miss Marple's eyes roamed over the cottages, noting the way curtains twitched with furtive glances, the hesitant steps of postmen, and the lowered heads of those who met her along the lane. She observed Simmons emerging from Melchett Grange with papers tucked under his arm, his posture rigid yet betraying a faint tremor in his hands, the kind of detail ordinary eyes would overlook. She tucked her basket closer and nodded gently, a silent acknowledgement that she understood more than she let on, though her expression betrayed nothing. By mid-morning, a small group had gathered near the village green, the hub of gossip and subtle social hierarchies, each participant eager to assess and interpret the events at the Grange. Mrs. Price Ridley, as always, had taken the role of unofficial narrator, speaking in a voice low enough to maintain an air of discretion, yet deliberate in its emphasis, highlighting the Colonel's altered will and the presence of Miss Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, watched carefully, noting the reactions of those around her. Mr. Tucker's eyebrows drew together in consternation at each new piece of information, while Miss Greenway's lips pressed tightly as though she feared saying too much and revealing knowledge not yet verified. The subtleties of these gestures, combined with the cadence of speech and the choice of words, were far more telling than the stories themselves, and Miss Marple catalogued them quietly in her mind, like stitches forming a pattern that would later make perfect sense. Inside the Grange, Mr. Pettigrew had begun reviewing the will with Simmons and Dr. Haydock. Each detail scrutinized and recorded with precise diligence, Miss Marple lingered nearby, pretending to inquire about the local flowers, but actually observing the subtle interactions within the room. Simmons' fingers, despite his efforts at composure, traced the edges of the papers nervously, and his eyes flickered repeatedly toward Miss Delorier, who maintained a carefully controlled demeanor, yet occasionally betrayed a slight quiver of the lip or a tightening of the jaw. These small signs, Miss Marple recognized, were the language of concealed knowledge and latent anxiety, and she noted them for later reflection. The solicitor's brow, meanwhile, was creased with concentration, and though his voice remained calm, the occasional stiff inflection suggested he was aware of more than he was prepared to share openly, a careful balance of candor and circumspection. By noon, the tension outside the Grange had begun to mount. Villagers passed in clusters, exchanging whispers, their eyes darting toward the house with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple, moving among them with the quiet grace of someone completely absorbed in her knitting and errands, could interpret every glance and gesture as a deliberate communication. The postmistress's hand lingered over letters before dropping them back into the box, a minor hesitation that implied she had overheard something she wished to conceal, while Mrs. Bantry's whispered commentary betrayed both excitement and fear, her voice soft enough to avoid offending, yet sharp in its intensity. Miss Marple catalogued each nuance, recognizing that human reactions rarely lie entirely, and that patterns emerged in clusters of small, almost imperceptible behavior. In the Grange, a new development caught her attention. A letter, delivered quietly to Simmons by a footman from the neighboring estate, was passed along with a subtle urgency, and the slight stiffness in the butler's stance betrayed the importance of the correspondence. Miss Delorier's eyes momentarily widened, her composure faltering for a fraction of a second before she regained control, a reaction Miss Marple noted with quiet approval. The solicitor's attention shifted immediately, and Miss Marple observed the careful way he extracted the contents without drawing unnecessary attention to the event. Each movement, each pause, each glance carried weight, and Miss Marple knew that while the letter's contents were unknown to her, the human reactions to it revealed far more than words ever could. By mid-afternoon, the solicitor and Dr. Haydock had left the Grange, leaving Simmons and Miss Deloria behind. Miss Marple took the opportunity to cross the threshold under the pretense of delivering a small package for Mrs. Price Ridley, though her true aim was to observe the interactions in the relative privacy of the hallway. Simmons maintained his usual composure outwardly, but could not fully disguise the tension in his shoulders, and Miss Deloria continued to display subtle signs of nervousness. The constant shifting of her weight, the small deliberate movements of her hands, and the faint pursing of her lips whenever she thought she was unobserved. Miss Marple, sitting briefly on a chair by the window, considered the sequence of reactions and counter-reactions, recognizing the interplay of fear, loyalty, and suppressed knowledge that was shaping the day's events. As evening approached, Miss Marple made her way back along the village lanes, her mind weaving together the observations collected throughout the day. The villagers, too, were settling into a tense anticipation, their conversations laced with speculation and subtle innuendo, each individual reacting to the events according to personal interest and bias. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Simmons' anxiety, Miss Deloria's nervous composure, and the silent weight of information held by the solicitor. Each nuance, when considered in conjunction with the others, suggested that the outward appearance of propriety was concealing layers of motivation, fear, and perhaps unspoken guilt. The pattern was beginning to emerge, delicate and intricate, yet unmistakable to the careful observer, and Miss Marple, as always, was patient, knowing that the truth, when approached quietly and methodically, would reveal itself in due course, layer by layer, in the ordinary rhythm of St. Mary Mead. The following morning, a low mist clung to the village, softening the edges of hedgerows and cottages, and Miss Marple walked along the familiar lanes with the quiet precision of someone intent on observing without being observed. The stillness of the air belied the undercurrent of tension she had already sensed, a subtle but pervasive feeling that events at Melchett Grange were far from ordinary. As she passed the green, she noted the furtive glances of villagers gathered in small groups, the way some heads ducked behind shawls or collars, and the slight stiffening of shoulders whenever a newcomer approached. Every nuance, however minor it might appear, was a thread in the tapestry of human behavior that Miss Marple had spent decades learning to read. She paused momentarily near the post office to exchange pleasantries with Miss Greenway, who, despite her cheerful greetings, could not entirely hide the faint tremor in her hands and the nervous flicker of her eyes toward the Grange. Miss Marple filed these observations away silently, aware that fear and anticipation, though unspoken, often revealed far more than overt statements. At the Grange, the morning bustle had begun with an air of forced normality. Simmons, ever diligent, moved with measured steps, carrying documents and arranging papers as though their precise order could somehow maintain the order of the household itself. Miss Deloria appeared briefly in the hallway, adjusting the drapery and straightening vases with a composure that barely masked the tension she carried. Miss Marple, arriving under the guise of delivering a note from Mrs. Price Ridley, observed these movements with careful attention, noting the faint tightening of Simmons' jaw whenever the young companion's eyes met his, and the subtle hesitation in her own hands as she positioned objects. The interplay of these small gestures was a silent conversation, a reflection of anxiety, loyalty, and perhaps apprehension of a truth yet unspoken. By mid-morning, a carriage arrived from the neighboring village, bringing Mr. Pettigrew once again to the Grange. His presence drew immediate attention from those inside, and Miss Marple noted the careful choreography that followed. Simmons greeting the solicitor with formal courtesy, but with an unmistakable tremor of awareness. Miss Delorier maintaining a poised exterior, yet her eyes betraying brief moments of uncertainty. And Dr. Haydock, who arrived simultaneously, consulting in hushed tones with Simmons as though weighing the significance of each small action. Outside, the villagers' curiosity was palpable. Whispered speculation and sidelong glances traveled along the green, carrying conjecture that ranged from innocent curiosity to barely concealed accusation. Miss Marple, observing quietly from the periphery, recognized the familiar patterns of human behavior. People's eagerness to interpret incomplete information often revealed as much about themselves as about the events they discussed inside the Grange. The solicitor produced documents with deliberate care, carefully explaining procedural matters while remaining guarded about any substantive revelations. Miss Marple took note of Simmons's reaction. The slight catch in his breath, the repeated smoothing of his coat, the brief but telling glance toward Miss Delorier, as well as the young woman's composure, which, while outwardly flawless, betrayed subtle micro-expressions of concern. These fleeting signs, invisible to those less attentive, suggested a landscape of emotion and motivation beneath the surface of polite conversation. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each gesture, each hesitation, each nuanced shift, assembling a framework of character and intention that could later illuminate the puzzle surrounding the Colonel's death and the sudden appearance of his revised will. By noon, the village itself seemed to hold its breath, the usual hum of activity subdued by the gravity of recent events. Mrs. Bantry, as ever, had stationed herself in her favored spot near the green, ready to relay each small observation with theatrical emphasis, while Mr. Tucker attempted to interject his own theories, often overestimating the significance of minor details. Miss Marple moved unobtrusively among the clusters of villagers, listening, noting, and quietly interpreting the patterns of gossip and behavior. She recognized immediately that fear, pride, and the need for social propriety were shaping each conversation and gesture, revealing intentions and attitudes that were not expressed outright. Each moment, when considered in its totality, brought her closer to understanding the web of relationships and hidden motives within Melchett Grange. As the afternoon light deepened, Miss Marple lingered near the edge of the Grange grounds, observing the interactions of those within. Simmons carrying out his duties with controlled precision, Miss Delorier's occasional faltering composure, and the solicitor's careful attention to procedure and propriety. Outside, villagers moved past with measured curiosity, their eyes lingering, their whispers carrying stories half-formed. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment to reflect on the significance of small gestures, realizing that the invisible currents of fear, loyalty, and suspicion were more revealing than any direct testimony could be. Each careful observation, catalogued in her mind, was another step toward unraveling the mystery, and she knew that in due course the pattern would emerge fully, each subtle clue fitting seamlessly into the overall narrative of Colonel Melchett's final days. As evening approached, the quiet tension persisted. Miss Marple returned along the lanes toward her cottage, her steps unhurried yet precise, her mind weaving together the threads of observation collected throughout the day. The villagers' muted chatter, Simmons' anxious diligence, Miss Delorier's poised but trembling demeanor, and the solicitor's guarded conduct formed a complex lattice of human behavior, one that could only be understood through patience, attention, and insight. Sitting finally by her window with her knitting in hand, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate interplay of fear, curiosity, and hidden motives, understanding that beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, the subtle machinery of human intentions was quietly at work, and that the revelation of truth, when it came, would be as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. The morning air was sharp and clear as Miss Marple set out once more, her eyes immediately drawn to the subtle signs of unrest in St. Mary Mead. Even the smallest details, the way a gate swung slightly ajar, the cautious glance of a passing child, the faint tension in Mrs. Bantry's usually relaxed posture, spoke volumes about the village's mood. She carried her basket lightly, a pretense that concealed the careful observation she was undertaking, noting every mannerism, every shift of expression, and every pause in speech. The previous day's events had left ripples throughout the community, and while the outward appearances suggested calm, Miss Marple, who had long understood the dissonance between appearances and reality, recognized the tremors of anxiety and suspicion that underlay each interaction. Simmons' composure, for instance, remained impeccable on the surface, yet she had already observed the subtle quivers of his hands and the fleeting shadows of worry that crossed his otherwise disciplined features. Miss Delorier, too, exhibited the delicate balance of restraint and unease, managing to maintain a polite exterior while betraying, in the smallest gestures, the tension she felt at every turn. By mid-morning, the Grange was again the focal point of activity, as the solicitor returned with additional documents and questions that required delicate attention. Miss Marple, blending into the background with the casual air of someone attending to trivial matters, noted each movement, each exchange of glances, and every whispered word that hinted at information not meant to be shared openly. Simmons met Mr. Pettigrew at the door, and the butler's slight hesitation before handing over papers suggested more than procedural diligence. It hinted at an internal calculation of consequences and loyalties. Miss Delorier remained nearby, her posture impeccable, but her fingers betraying subtle tremors as she adjusted a decorative vase. These minor, almost imperceptible signals, Miss Marple knew, were often more telling than overt statements, for human nature revealed itself most clearly in the unconscious expressions of emotion. Outside, the villagers were beginning to sense that the events at the Grange would not resolve quietly. Groups formed and dissolved along the green, their conversations hushed yet urgent, each person measuring how much to reveal or conceal. Mrs. Price Ridley continued to act as the unofficial herald of the story, her voice low but urgent, emphasizing minor details as though they were of monumental significance, while Mr. Tucker offered his own interpretations, full of speculative flourish, occasionally contradicting Mrs. Price Ridley's version with grandiose insistence. Miss Marple, ever attentive, allowed these exchanges to unfold, not merely listening to the words, but carefully observing posture, tone, and fleeting expressions, noting which individuals spoke with genuine concern, which with eagerness to impress, and which with thinly veiled fear. Each nuance was a piece of a puzzle she was quietly assembling, one that would eventually reveal more than any single witness could articulate. Inside the Grange, the solicitor, having laid out the relevant documents, engaged in cautious conversation with Dr. Haydock and Simmons, discussing matters that touched upon the Colonel's intentions, recent visitors, and the peculiar changes to his will. Miss Marple, ostensibly tending to the window-sill flowers and straightening a rug, quietly took in every movement and every expression, cataloguing the slight hesitations, the minute adjustments, the almost imperceptible reactions to statements made in passing. Miss Delorier, standing nearby, managed to maintain her outward calm, yet the rapid blink of her eyes, the slight narrowing of her gaze, and the subtle tilt of her head betrayed a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. These were the kinds of details Miss Marple relied upon, the silent language of emotion and intention that, when pieced together, revealed the truth beneath layers of politeness and social convention. By noon, Miss Marple had ventured outside once more to observe the village in the context of the unfolding events. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual hubbub replaced by cautious movement and hushed speech. Villagers passed one another with lowered eyes, furtive glances, and whispered asides, clearly aware that something significant was afoot. The human patterns she had already catalogued, The gestures, the hesitations, the fleeting expressions of guilt, fear, or curiosity were mirrored and multiplied in these interactions, creating a network of subtle signals that spoke to the anxieties and suspicions rippling through the community. Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of psychology and social dynamics, recognized the importance of observing these outward manifestations as a reflection of hidden intentions. As afternoon waned, a small commotion at the Grange drew Miss Marple's attention. A letter, delivered discreetly, prompted a series of almost imperceptible reactions. Simmons's shoulders stiffened, Miss Delorier's composure flickered for a heartbeat, and the solicitor, whose expression had remained neutral, allowed a brief tightening of his lips. Miss Marple, standing at a careful distance, noted every subtle shift, understanding that such moments, though seemingly minor, were often the hinges upon which the entire narrative turned. With patience and quiet deliberation, she allowed events to continue, cataloguing each movement, each glance, each micro-expression, knowing that these threads would eventually converge into a coherent picture of motives, intentions, and hidden truths. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple retraced her steps toward her cottage, the soft evening light casting long shadows across the lanes. The village remained suspended in an uneasy calm, every interaction tinged with the uncertainty of what had occurred and what was yet to be revealed. Sitting by her window later, knitting quietly as the last rays of sunlight faded, Miss Marple reflected on the day's observations. Simmons's restrained tension, Miss Delorier's delicate anxiety, the solicitor's careful control, and the villagers' myriad reactions all contributed to a growing mosaic of human behavior that, when fully interpreted, would illuminate the hidden currents at play in the Grange. She understood that patience and careful attention would reveal the truth, and that, as always, the ordinary rhythms of St. Mary Mead concealed a web of extraordinary human motives waiting to be unraveled. The morning unfolded with a subdued quiet over St. Mary Mead, a calm that seemed to conceal the heightened awareness of the villagers who moved cautiously through the lanes, and along the village green, Miss Marple, strolling with her habitual unhurried grace, noted immediately the subtle changes in demeanor among her neighbors. Mrs. Bantry, usually effervescent, now kept her hands clasped in front of her, glancing repeatedly toward the Grange with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Mr. Tucker's heavy steps were slowed by the burden of thought, his eyes narrowing as he attempted to puzzle out the implications of the Colonel's sudden death and the newly revealed will. Even the children, ordinarily boisterous, tiptoed past the hedges, their voices hushed as though they sensed the invisible tension that hung over the village. Miss Marple took these observations in with careful attention, noting the subtle hesitations, the fleeting glances, and the small signs of unease, for she knew that the truth often revealed itself most clearly in the unconscious expressions of fear, pride, and expectation. At Melchett Grange, the day began with an air of controlled activity, each participant carefully maintaining appearances while concealing their own anxieties. Simmons moved with measured precision, distributing letters and organizing documents, yet the slight stiffness of his shoulders and the occasional faltering of his normally precise steps betrayed the weight of his inner concern. Miss Delorier, poised and composed, attended to minor tasks around the hallway, adjusting vases and smoothing carpets with the precision of someone determined to maintain order in the face of uncertainty. Miss Marple entered quietly under the pretense of delivering a small parcel from a neighbor, allowing her to observe the subtle dynamics of the household without drawing attention to her own scrutiny. Her eyes caught the brief flash of recognition when Simmons's gaze met Miss Delorier's. The almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw and the delicate quiver of her fingers, all of which spoke volumes about the undercurrents of tension that ran through the Grange. By mid-morning, a new arrival brought further ripples of intrigue. Mr. Pettigrew, the solicitor, returned with a carefully compiled bundle of documents, and his presence immediately drew attention, Prompting a flurry of controlled movements and cautious exchanges, Simmons received him with impeccable politeness. But the micro-expressions, the slight hitch of the breath, the subtle hesitation before extending papers, the careful avoidance of prolonged eye contact, revealed that even he was not immune to the stress of unfolding events. Miss Deloria stood nearby, her calm exterior maintained with great effort, though Miss Marple could detect the momentary tightening of her lips, the blink of eyes too rapid to be casual, and the subtle shift of weight from one foot to the other, small indicators of inner turmoil and anticipation. These, Miss Marple reflected, were the true language of human behavior, far more revealing than the measured words spoken in deference to social conventions. Outside, the village was alive with whispered speculation and cautious observation. Groups gathered and dispersed, their conversations laden with conjecture, half-formed theories, and hints of information gleaned from snippets of conversation. Mrs. Price Ridley continued her role as the informal chronicler of events, emphasizing minor details with a dramatic flourish that betrayed her delight in having knowledge not yet widely known. Mr. Tucker interjected repeatedly with his own interpretations, often exaggerating the significance of trivial occurrences in a manner that revealed more about his character than the events themselves. Miss Marple moved unobtrusively among these clusters, listening attentively, recording subtle gestures, fleeting expressions, and the interplay of curiosity and fear. Each observation was catalogued carefully, forming an intricate mosaic of social and emotional cues that would, in time, illuminate the hidden motives surrounding Colonel Melchett's death. As noon approached, Miss Marple returned her attention to the Grange, noting a letter that had arrived quietly, passed from one hand to another with deliberate discretion. Simmons's posture stiffened momentarily, Miss Deloria's composure faltered for a heartbeat, and even the solicitor's otherwise neutral expression betrayed a fleeting tension. Miss Marple, standing at a respectful distance, catalogued these minute reactions, recognizing them as indicators of significance. Every tremor, every hesitation, every subtle glance was a clue, a fragment of the larger puzzle, and she understood that while the contents of the letter were unknown, the human response it provoked revealed volumes about hidden concerns, unspoken knowledge, and possible motives. By mid-afternoon, the Grange settled into a tense rhythm, with outward appearances of ordinary activity, masking the underlying currents of anxiety, secrecy, and expectation. Miss Marple, walking once more along the lanes that led to her cottage, reflected on the day's observations. Each villager, each household member, and each minor interaction had contributed to a growing understanding of the social and psychological landscape surrounding the Colonel's passing Simmons' careful diligence, Miss Delorier's poised unease, the solicitor's guarded attentiveness, and the villagers' subtle cues of concern and curiosity all formed part of an intricate web. Miss Marple knew that, with patience and careful attention, these threads would eventually converge into clarity. Sitting by her window later, she allowed herself a quiet moment of contemplation, recognizing that beneath the surface of ordinary life in St. Mary Mead, human motives and secrets were slowly revealing themselves, and that the coming days would bring further insight into the true nature of events at Melchett Grange. The morning sun filtered through the thin haze that lingered over St. Mary Mead, casting delicate shafts of light across the village lanes and the neatly trimmed hedgerows. Miss Marple, walking at her accustomed leisurely pace, sensed immediately that the day held more significance than its quiet exterior suggested. The villagers moved with a cautious awareness, exchanging glances and hushed words, each interaction weighted with the knowledge that something unusual had disrupted the usual rhythm of life. Even the children, normally oblivious to social subtleties, clung to the edges of the green, their eyes darting toward the Grange as if drawn by invisible strings of curiosity and fear. Miss Marple noted all of this, cataloguing gestures and expressions with the practiced precision that had long been her most powerful tool. Every hesitation, every fleeting glance, every subtle adjustment of posture was a fragment of the larger human story unfolding before her eyes, and she understood that the truth lay in these small, almost imperceptible signals rather than in spoken words alone. At the Grange, Simmons moved with the habitual efficiency that masked the strain beneath. He carried documents, arranged correspondence, and supervised minor domestic tasks, all with the outward precision of someone determined to maintain normality. Yet Miss Marple observed the slight tightening of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible quiver in his fingers, and the occasional lingering glance toward Miss Delorier, subtle indicators of the internal stress he could not entirely suppress. Miss Delorier herself moved with delicate composure, her hands engaged in small household adjustments, smoothing carpets and repositioning ornaments with the meticulous care of someone striving to preserve order amid unease. Still, her eyes betrayed fleeting moments of hesitation, the rapid blink and the faint tightening of her lips, hints of the anxieties she carried in response to events at the Grange. Miss Marple, entering under the pretext of delivering a note from a neighbor, took up a position in the hallway that allowed her to observe these small but significant interactions without revealing her own scrutiny. By mid-morning, the arrival of the solicitor introduced a fresh layer of tension. Mr. Pettigrew, documents in hand, moved with careful formality, and his presence elicited subtle but revealing responses from those within the Grange. Simmons received him with impeccable politeness, yet the slight hesitation before passing over papers, the measured deepening of his breath, and the almost imperceptible avoidance of eye contact betrayed the calculated restraint of a man aware of delicate truths. Miss Delorier remained composed, yet the brief flicker of recognition in her gaze, the tilt of her head, and the gentle clenching of her fists suggested that she, too, understood the gravity of the solicitor's visit and the implications it might hold. Miss Marple catalogued every nuance, recognizing that the unspoken language of expression, gesture, and micro-reaction often revealed more about intention and motive than any formal statement could. Outside, the villagers had begun to coalesce into small groups, their conversations low and urgent, charged with curiosity and speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley, ever the unofficial chronicler, emphasized details with a careful blend of caution and flair, drawing attention to minor occurrences as though they held the keys to the larger mystery. Mr. Tucker, unable to resist inserting his interpretations, often exaggerated the significance of trivial events, his gesticulations and emphatic tone revealing more about his own inclinations than about reality. Miss Marple, weaving unobtrusively among these clusters, paid attention not just to what was said, but to what was withheld, to the pauses, the glances, the unspoken assumptions that carried the weight of human intention. She understood that fear, pride, and social proprieties were as revealing as any confession, and the careful reading of such signs was critical to uncovering the full picture. As noon approached, a subtle development occurred within the Grange that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. A letter delivered quietly to Simmons prompted a chain of nearly invisible reactions. The brief stiffening of his posture, Miss Delorier's momentary faltering of composure, and a micro-expression of tension across the solicitor's otherwise impassive face. Miss Marple observed from a discreet vantage point, understanding that while the letter's contents were unknown, the human responses it elicited were themselves significant. Each tremor, hesitation, and furtive glance was a clue, a reflection of hidden knowledge, fear, and the careful calibration of actions to maintain appearances. These small but telling signs were the pieces of a puzzle she would, with patience, eventually assemble into a coherent narrative. By mid-afternoon, the rhythm of the Grange had settled into an uneasy normality, yet Miss Marple, moving back along the village lanes toward her cottage, continued to interpret the social and psychological patterns she had observed Simmons careful, Diligence, Miss Deloria's poised but trembling attention, the solicitor's guarded conduct, and the villager's subtle cues of curiosity and apprehension all contributed to a delicate web of human interaction. Miss Marple reflected on the layered interplay of fear, secrecy, and loyalty, understanding that beneath the veneer of ordinary life, motives and intentions were quietly asserting themselves. Sitting by her window later, knitting calmly as evening shadows lengthened across the garden, she contemplated the day's observations, recognizing that the emerging mosaic of gestures, expressions, and reactions would, in due time, reveal the hidden truths behind the events at Melchett Grange, and that patience and careful attention would illuminate the full picture with a clarity that no hurried investigation could match. The morning light filtered gently through the mist that hung over St. Mary Mead, lending an almost ethereal quality to the familiar lanes and hedgerows. Miss Marple walked with deliberate ease, her mind occupied with the observations she had gathered over the past days. Every subtle movement, every flicker of expression, every hesitant gesture she had noted in Simmons, Miss Delorier, and the villagers now began to form patterns in her mind, delicate threads weaving together a larger understanding. Even the smallest details, the way Mrs. Bantry's eyes lingered on the Grange, the children's quiet whispers as they passed, the postmistress's almost imperceptible pause before delivering letters, contributed to the rich tapestry of human behavior Miss Marple relied upon. She understood that the outward calm of the village masked an undercurrent of anxiety and speculation, and that this tension, if read carefully, could guide her to the truth. At the Grange, the morning bustle had started as usual, though every movement was now subtly charged with awareness. Simmons moved efficiently through the halls, arranging papers and coordinating minor tasks with a precision that almost concealed the strain behind it. Miss Delorier maintained her composure, attending to small household duties, adjusting ornaments and smoothing carpets. Yet Miss Marple noted the slight falter in her hand, the tension in her shoulders, and the faint narrowing of her eyes when she believed herself unobserved. Even the way she shifted her weight from foot to foot was a signal of restrained apprehension. Miss Marple, under the pretense of delivering a small note from a neighbor, observed these interactions with careful attention, cataloguing each subtle signal as part of the growing mosaic of human behavior she had been compiling over the past days. By mid-morning, a new element introduced a ripple of unease through the household. A messenger from the solicitor arrived, carrying papers that required Simmons' immediate attention. The brief pause before he accepted the documents, the quick glance exchanged with Miss Delorier, and the faint tightening of his lips, all occurred in a sequence that spoke volumes. Miss Delorier, despite her outward composure, exhibited the tiniest flickers of anxiety. Her fingers fidgeted slightly with a handkerchief. Her eyes shifted toward the corners of the room, and her lips pressed together in a controlled manner. Mr. Pettigrew, meticulous and measured as ever, handled the papers with calm professionalism, yet Miss Marple observed a fleeting twitch in his brow, a silent acknowledgement of significance that he did not voice aloud. Each of these minor movements was, in Miss Marple's experience, far more revealing than any spoken remark, and she stored them carefully in her memory. Outside, the village was alive with quiet anticipation. Groups of villagers formed along the green, exchanging whispers, sidelong glances, and small conjectures that were laden with personal biases and curiosity. Mrs. Price Ridley recounted every minor detail she had gleaned, emphasizing the parts that most excited her imagination, while Mr. Tucker, eager to assert his own interpretations, often contradicted her in a loud but not overbearing tone. Miss Marple, moving unobtrusively among them, noted not only what was said, but the subtle reactions of body language, the fleeting expressions of fear, pride, or envy, and the hesitation in speech when someone felt unsure. She understood, as she always had, that these unguarded signs of human nature were far more telling than the words themselves, and that they provided insight into both motive and character. By early afternoon, the day's quiet routine was interrupted by the discreet arrival of another letter for Simmons, delivered with an almost imperceptible urgency. The reaction it provoked, though subtle, was immediately evident to Miss Marple. Simmons's shoulders stiffened, his breathing deepened slightly, and his gaze flicked momentarily toward Miss Delorier. She, in turn, exhibited the tiniest crack in her otherwise controlled demeanor. A blink too rapid, a brief tightening of her jaw, signals that suggested awareness and concern. Even the solicitor, watching from a short distance, betrayed a fleeting but meaningful micro-expression of tension. Miss Marple, observing from a corner of the hallway, catalogued these responses carefully, recognizing that the human reaction to information, even more than the information itself, revealed the layers of knowledge, worry, and potential motive present in the household. By mid-afternoon, the Grange resumed its measured activity, outwardly calm yet charged with an invisible tension. Miss Marple, returning along the village lanes toward her cottage, reflected upon the intricate web of human behavior she had witnessed. Each subtle gesture, glance, and hesitation contributed to a growing understanding of the hidden forces at work. Simmons' careful diligence, Miss Delorier's fragile composure, the solicitor's quiet calculation, and the villager's speculative unease all formed part of a complex social network. Sitting by her window later, knitting in the waning light, Miss Marple considered the delicate interplay of fear, secrecy, and expectation that underlay the apparent calm of St. Mary Mead, confident that with careful observation and patient reflection, the full pattern of motives and hidden truths would eventually be revealed, bringing clarity to the mysterious circumstances surrounding Colonel Melchett's death. The sun had begun its slow descent over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the lanes and gardens, and Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her favorite armchair by the window, felt the day's observations crystallize in her mind. The intricate patterns of behavior, the fleeting expressions, and the subtle gestures she had catalogued over the past days were now aligned, forming a coherent picture that others, distracted by assumptions and social performances, had failed to see. Simmons's meticulous diligence, Miss Delorier's poised tension, the solicitor's guarded movements, and the villager's whispered speculations had all contributed pieces to the puzzle, each revealing motivations, fears, and concealed truths. Miss Marple understood that the Colonel's sudden death and the appearance of his hidden will had not occurred in a vacuum. Rather, they were the culmination of personal resentments, carefully concealed rivalries, and human desires that had lain dormant until the moment when opportunity and secrecy intersected. That evening, she made her way to Melchett Grange under the polite pretense of returning a small parcel, a visit that allowed her to observe the household in an unguarded state. The air within the Grange was taut with expectation, every movement measured, every expression fleetingly controlled. Simmons, carrying papers with an almost exaggerated steadiness, betrayed a slight faltering step when Miss Marple entered, while Miss Delorier, standing near the fireplace, adjusted her posture as though bracing herself for an unseen evaluation. Mr. Pettigrew, formally polite as ever, handled his documents with the same careful precision, but his eyes flickered with subtle curiosity toward the two residents, registering reactions that they could not fully conceal. Miss Marple, offering gentle pleasantries and quietly arranging a vase on a side table, allowed the patterns to reveal themselves naturally, knowing that under the slightest provocation, each person would betray a nuance that could illuminate their motives. She began by engaging Miss Delorier in conversation about trivial domestic matters, her tone casual and unassuming, yet every question was crafted to elicit a response that revealed more than the words themselves. Miss Delorier's composure faltered under the subtle pressure. Her eyes widened imperceptibly at one question, her hands trembled ever so slightly when reaching for a teacup, and the faint tightening of her lips betrayed a combination of guilt and apprehension. Miss Marple noted each of these small clues with satisfaction, recognizing them as part of the larger human pattern she had been piecing together. Moving to Simmons, she inquired about the timing of certain letters and documents, phrasing her questions in a way that appeared conversational. Yet she observed the quickening of his breath, the momentary hesitation in his hands, and the careful avoidance of eye contact. Each micro-reaction confirmed her suspicions. Someone within the Grange had deliberately manipulated events surrounding the Colonel's estate to their advantage. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to progress naturally, never accusing, never pressing overtly, yet subtly orchestrating the atmosphere to reveal the underlying truth. She recalled the micro-signals that had troubled her throughout the previous days. The letter delivered discreetly, Simmons' minute but telling gestures of concern, Miss Deloria's fleeting expressions of anxiety, and the villagers' scattered gossip, which had often pointed to misdirection rather than clarity. She considered how these details aligned with the timing of the Colonel's final instructions, the hidden clauses in his will, and the human tendency toward both ambition and secrecy. With quiet precision, she began to outline the sequence of actions, motives, and psychological pressures that had converged to produce the seemingly inexplicable events surrounding the Grange. Finally, Miss Marple addressed the room with gentle certainty, recounting the small details that, when taken together, revealed the orchestrated manipulation of the estate and the deliberate concealment of the Colonel's true intentions. She explained how Simmons, in his desire to protect the household and simultaneously advance his own interests, had delayed certain communications and controlled access to critical documents, while Miss Deloria, motivated by loyalty mixed with fear, had unwittingly participated in this concealment, her own anxieties betraying her at crucial moments, the solicitor's careful neutrality, the villagers' distracted speculations, and even minor human reactions were woven into her explanation, demonstrating how each contributed to the complex web of intention and misdirection. By the time she concluded, the room was silent, the truth resonating with clarity that no single observation alone could have revealed. With the revelation complete, the household slowly settled into a quiet acceptance, the tension easing as understanding replaced speculation. Miss Marple, serene and unassuming, took her leave, stepping back into the soft evening light that bathed the village lanes. The villagers, though still cautious, began to resume their routines, the extraordinary events of recent days leaving their mark but no longer dominating their lives. Miss Marple, walking toward her cottage, reflected on the persistent patterns of human nature she had observed. The interplay of fear, loyalty, ambition, and secrecy, and the way small, subtle behaviors could unveil truths hidden beneath layers of social performance. She understood that St. Mary Mead would continue, as it always did, under its quiet rhythms, yet now tempered by the knowledge that even the most ordinary of places held depths of intrigue, and that human nature, in all its complexity, could be deciphered by the patient and observant eye.